Jnanam paramam dhyayam. Knowledge is supreme.
In the last lecture, we looked at how to find the rates for different steps in the catalytic reaction. In today's lecture, we will start looking at how to find out what is the actual rate or what is the rate limiting step, and how to find out the rate of reaction taking into account the rate limiting step in the catalytic reaction. So, at steady state, supposing if the species A is going to products B, at steady state the rate at which the species is actually being consumed, that should be equal to the adsorption rate, that should be equal to rate at which the surface reaction is happening, and that should be equal to rate at which the desorption is happening. Now, the question is, which one is actually controlling the overall reaction? So, in fact, it turns out usually that one of these steps is actually the slowest step in the catalytic reaction. And in fact, if the slowest step is identified, then one can think of how to accelerate the slowest step, and accelerating the slowest step would actually accelerate the overall conversion of reactant species into the products. That is because all the other steps are faster than this one, and they do not really control the overall reaction rate. So, the overall reaction rate can be tweaked and controlled and accelerated only if we identify which one is the slowest step in that particular reaction. So, let us look at that. So, which step is the slowest, and automatically this implies that if we identify which one is the slowest, that will be the rate controlling step. So, let us look at a few examples. Ammonia synthesis, for instance. So, the overall reaction is given by this step where hydrogen and N2 in the presence of iron catalyst gives ammonia, and the detailed mechanism that governs this ammonia synthesis process is essentially given by hydrogen, which actually gets adsorbed onto the catalyst site, and nitrogen also gets adsorbed onto the catalyst site, and then N2S uses another site to form 2NS, and then N dot S, that is nitrogen adsorbed onto the catalyst site, reacts with the hydrogen adsorbed onto the catalyst site, which gives HNS plus leaves out another site, and then HNS reacts with another molecule of the hydrogen molecule bound to the active sites, and it gives H2N dot S plus S, and then H2N dot S plus another HS gives NH3S plus S, and this NH3S essentially desorbs from the catalyst site and gives out a free site. So, this step is actually known to be a rapid step, which is basically the adsorption process, one of the adsorption steps, and then this adsorption step of nitrogen is actually known to be the rate limiting step. and these three are the surface reaction steps, and this is the desorption step. So, note that in this example I have said that the rate limiting step is basically the adsorption of nitrogen onto the catalyst sites and not necessarily the adsorption of hydrogen onto the catalyst site. And in fact, you should also observe that I have actually put a single side arrow. In fact, the hydrogen adsorption onto the catalyst side, it turns out is actually an irreversible step in this particular detailed mechanism, and in fact this mechanism is known to be the mechanism that supports the ammonia synthesis using this process. So, in this case the adsorption is actually the rate limiting step here. So, this is the adsorption of N2 is actually the rate limiting step, and so the overall reaction is essentially controlled by this particular rate limiting step of the ammonia synthesis process. So, let us look at another example where the surface reaction is actually the rate limiting step. So, let us look at the reaction CO plus NO in the presence of copper catalyst gives CO2 plus half N2, and in fact CO and NO are known to be the noxious automobile exhaust gases, and this cannot be let in, these two are actually not environmentally very friendly. So, they need to be converted into CO2 and N2 in order to be let out into the atmosphere. So, this is a very important reaction which is usually conducted on copper catalyst, and the detailed mechanism is CO plus S reversibly binds to the catalyst site in the molecular form. Note that this is non-dissociated adsorption onto the catalyst site. And these two are known to be rapid steps. So, which means that the adsorption is actually not the rate controlling step here, and the reaction between the adsorbed species this is actually known to be the rate limiting step. The surface reaction here is actually known to be the rate limiting step, and then the desorption process these two are actually known to be rapid steps. So, in this case the surface reaction is actually the rate limiting step. Surface reaction is actually the rate limiting step that actually controls the overall rate of the reaction. So, let us look at how to actually synthesize a rate law once we know which one is the rate limiting step. Synthesizing rate law. So, the first step in synthesizing a rate law is essentially to postulate what should be the mechanism with which the reaction is happening, and once the mechanism is decided, we propose as to or postulate what is the rate controlling step, and then we use that to determine what should be the rate law that actually controls the overall reaction rate. So, let us look at each of these cases. We will take a specific example and we look at each of the cases of whether adsorption is rate controlling, surface reaction is rate controlling, or desorption process is actually rate controlling. So, step number 1 is to postulate the mechanism and then decide on which one is the rate controlling step. Or rather assume and verify later and find the rate law and validate with experimental data. If the proposed postulates, if the proposed mechanism or the assumption of which one is the rate controlling step which leads to a certain rate law does not satisfy the experimental data, then we need to iterate on this, repeat this process till we get the right model and the correct rate law that actually governs the particular process we are looking at. So, we will synthesize the rate law for a specific example of cumene getting converted to so this is cumene, we will refer to this as C, and then we will, this gets converted to benzene, let us write this as B, refer to this as B, and propylene, let us refer to this species as P. Okay. Let us assume that Langmuir-Hinshelwood mechanism is valid. Let us assume Langmuir-Hinshelwood mechanism. Remember that we have to first postulate a mechanism, then assume a certain whichever is the rate controlling step, followed by find out or synthesize the rate law and then validate with experiments. So, let us start by assuming that the Langmuir-Hinshelwood mechanism is a mechanism that captures this reaction, catalytic reaction of C giving B plus P, where C is cumene, B is benzene and P is propylene. Okay. So, let the detailed mechanism be cumene, which actually adsorbs onto the active site. So, that is the adsorption step, and let us say that the corresponding adsorption and desorption constants are Ka and K minus A, Cs, Ks and K minus S are the corresponding forward and backward rate constants. So, this is the surface reaction. And then we have this is the desorption step. So, what we are going to do now is we are going to write the rate law for each of these steps, and one by one we are going to assume if adsorption is the rate limiting step, what will be the overall rate law, if surface reaction is the rate limiting step, what will be the overall rate law, and if desorption is the rate limiting step, what will be the rate law. So, we will see each of these three cases separately. So, the rates of each of these steps are AD is equal to Ka Pc Cv minus Cc dot S divided by Kc, where for adsorption step the rate is essentially given by the adsorption process, which depends on the partial pressure of cumene and the concentration of the vacant sites, and then we have the desorption step or detachment step, which depends on the concentration of the cumene which is adsorbed onto the active sites, and note that Kc is the equilibrium constant, adsorption equilibrium constant for cumene. Similarly, for surface reaction it is Ks into Cc dot S minus Cbs into partial pressure of propylene divided by Ks, and this is for surface reaction. And then we have Rd, which is the desorption step, which is Kd into Cb dot S minus Pb Cv divided by Kdc. This is the desorption equilibrium constant, but that is also equal to, this is the desorption equilibrium constant for benzene, and that is also equal to 1 by the adsorption equilibrium constant for the same species. So, therefore, we can rewrite this rate as Kd into Cbs minus Pb Cv into Kb. So, let us assume that adsorption is the rate limiting step. Let us assume that adsorption is rate limiting step. So, if adsorption is rate limiting step, then the surface reaction and the desorption process are relatively faster. So, essentially these two steps would quickly reach to an equilibrium. So, we can assume that these two steps are in equilibrium, and which means that the rate of the surface reaction and the rate of desorption are essentially equal to 0. So, if we impose these conditions, that is Rs equal to 0 and Rd equal to 0, then we will see that Ccs is essentially equal to Cbs into partial pressure of propylene divided by Ks, and Cbs is equal to Kb Pb into Cv. What we have done is essentially we have taken these two expressions, this expression and we have taken this expression, and then we have assumed that because this is a faster step, we have assumed that these two steps are in equilibrium and therefore the rates are equal to 0, and by assuming that the rates are equal to 0, we essentially estimated what is CCS and CBS. So from here we will see that CCS is equal to Kb Pb P propylene Cv divided by Ks. All I have done is I have substituted CBS into this expression. Now the rate of the overall reaction rate, let us say if I want to write overall reaction rate as Rc prime, which is the overall reaction rate with respect to cumene species, and that is essentially now given by the adsorption rate of that particular species, and that is equal to Ka into partial pressure of cumene into vacant sites minus Kb Pb Pp Cv divided by Ks into Kc, and that. So the unknown quantity here which is cannot be measured is the concentration of the vacant sites. So now we are going to use the conservation rule to essentially eliminate the concentration of the vacant sites. So Ct is the total concentration of the sites is equal to Cv plus CCS plus CBS, which is the concentration of the sites occupied by cumene and concentration of sites occupied by benzene. Okay. So that is equal to Cv plus Kb Pb partial pressure of propylene into vacant sites divided by Ks plus Kb Pb into Cv. So from here Cv is equal to Ct divided by 1 plus Kb Pb partial pressure of propylene divided by Ks plus Kb into Pb. So if we substitute Cv into the rate, we will see that minus Rc prime is equal to Ka Pc minus Pb by into partial pressure of propylene divided by Kp. So we can define Kp as the equilibrium constant with respect to pressure. So that will be Ks Kc divided by Kb, and that is equal to, and that multiplied by Ct divided by 1 plus divided by Ks Kb into Pb. So this essentially gives the overall rate at which the reaction is actually happening. Because it is adsorption control, all we have done is we have assumed that the other steps are actually at equilibrium, and we have eliminated those terms which may be present there, and then we found out what is the overall rate. So let us stare at this expression a bit. So suppose if at the initially if the benzene and propylene, which are the product species, are not present, then the partial pressures of these two are likely to be 0. So if at initial time t equal to 0, partial pressures of benzene and partial pressure of propylene is equal to 0, then this expression essentially boils down to, so this term goes to 0, this term goes to 0, and the first term goes to 0. So therefore at t in the initial phase, so initially minus Rc is essentially given by Ka Pc into Ct. So the initial rate is essentially a linear function of the partial pressure of cumene, and so we can now sketch this behavior. So if in the initial phase, if I now plot Pc versus the Rc prime, essentially one actually has a linear profile. The overall reaction rate, it actually depends linearly on the partial pressure of cumene in the initial phase. So let us now take the second case where we want to look at the situation where the surface reaction is actually rate limiting. So let us say that surface reaction is rate limiting. So, in this case we can assume that the rate of adsorption, that is actually in equilibrium, and rate of desorption is actually in equilibrium. So, now because of this we will see that CCS, which is the concentration of cumene attached to the sites, is essentially given by PC Cv into Kc, and this gives that CBS is equal to Kb Pb into Cv. So, from here we can substitute in the conservation rule. So, that will be Cv plus Pc Cv into Kc plus Kb Pv into Cv. So, that should be equal to Cv into 1 plus Pc into Kc plus Kb into Pb. So, from here Cv is equal to Ct divided by 1 plus Pc Kc plus Kb into Pb. So, now we can plug this expression into the rate at which the surface reaction happens. So, the overall reaction rate of cumene is essentially given by the rate at which the surface reaction happens, and that should be equal to Ks into Cs into Cbs, which is the concentration of benzene attached to the sites, multiplied by partial pressure of propylene divided by Ks, and that should be equal to, when we substitute the expression for CCS, CBS and Cv, we will see that the rate is equal to Ks Kc Ct multiplied by Pc minus by Kp divided by 1 plus Kc Pc plus Kb into Pb. So, all that is required is just substitute the concentration of CCS that we found a few moments ago and concentration of CBS in terms of the partial pressures and the equilibrium constant, and substitute for the concentration of the vacant sites. Then we can see that after a little bit of algebra, we can see that the rate at which the overall reaction happens is essentially given by this expression. So, once again, let us say initially Pb and Pp, let us say, are negligible. So, by setting these two equal to 0, we will see that initially minus Rc prime is equal to Ks into Kc into Ct into Pc divided by 1 plus Kc into Pc. It is no more linear. So, if the overall rate is actually controlled by the surface reaction, then the dependence of the overall rate on the partial pressure of cumene is no more linear as was observed for the case when the adsorption is rate limiting. So, let us try to sketch this. So, Pc in the initial stages initially and minus Rc prime. So, it will behave linearly for very small concentrations, it will behave linearly for very small concentrations, and then slowly it will become like this. So, clearly the overall rate, dependence of the overall rate on the partial pressure when the surface reaction is limiting is not same as the overall dependence of the overall rate on the partial pressure of cumene. In the adsorption case it is linear, while here you can see that it is not a linear relationship. Let us look at the third case where desorption may be the rate limiting step. Desorption step is actually rate limiting. So, in this case clearly the adsorption rate adsorption is at equilibrium. So, we can set RAD as 0, and the surface reaction is also at equilibrium. So, we can set RS as 0. So, from here we will see that Cs is equal to Cbs into partial pressure of propylene divided by Ks. So, that comes by setting the reaction rate is equal to 0, and by setting the adsorption rate equal to 0, one will get that Cs is equal to Kc Pc into Cv. So, from here Cbs is equal to Ks into Ccs divided by partial pressure of propylene. By substituting this expression, we will see that is equal to Ks Kc Pc into Cv divided by partial pressure of propylene. So, once again we substitute these in the conservation rule. So, we will find that the total concentration of the sites is equal to vacant sites plus Kc Pc into Cv plus Ks Kc Pc Cv divided by partial pressure of propylene, and from here Cv is equal to Ct divided by 1 plus Kc into Pc plus Ks Kc Pc divided by partial pressure of propylene. Okay. So, now we can substitute this in the rate of desorption, which is equal to the rate at which the overall reaction happens, and that should be equal to Kd multiplied by Cbs minus Kb Pb into Cv. So, substituting the expression for Cbs and Cv, we find that this is equal to Kd Ks into Kc multiplied by Pc divided by partial pressure of propylene minus Pb divided by Kp, and that into Ct divided by 1 plus Kc Pc plus Ks Kc Pc divided by partial pressure of propylene. So, we can further simplify this expression to get that Rd is equal to Kd Ks into Kc, that into Pc minus Pb partial pressure of propylene divided by Kp multiplied by Ct, the whole divided by partial pressure of propylene plus Kc Pc into partial pressure of propylene plus Ks Kc into Pc, and that will be the overall rate. So, in the initial phases, initially when partial pressure of benzene and partial pressure of P are negligible, we substitute that here. So, Rd, which is equal to minus Rc prime, will essentially be equal to Kd Ks Kc Pc Ct divided by Ks Kc into Pc. So, we can cancel out these. So, this is essentially equal to Kd into Ct. So, which means that it is not a function of the partial pressure of cumene. So, if I now plot the rate minus Rc prime versus Pc in the initial phase, then the curve will essentially be constant. So, clearly you can see that when adsorption is rate limiting, the initial reaction rate is actually a linear function of partial pressure of cumene, and if the surface reaction is rate limiting, it is no more a linear function, and if desorption is rate limiting, the rate is essentially constant, it is independent of the partial pressure of cumene in the initial stages. So, as one can see from this example, that depending upon whichever step is the rate limiting step, the overall reaction rate is likely to be different, and for every reaction that needs to be, every catalytic reaction that needs to be characterized, one needs to assume what is the rate limiting step, and then we need to make such a derivation by first assuming the mechanism and then deciding which one is the rate controlling step and find out what is the overall reaction rate, and this needs to be validated with the experimental data to gain confidence on if the mechanism that is assumed is correct and also the rate limiting step that is assumed is correct. Thank you.